So I'm just going to change this back to classic. I like to work in classic. So everyone's familiar with how to have an object move from left to right, up and down, and so on. And you can also have it go up and down if you like. So just to recap, I'm going to draw a circle. I'm going to create a tween. So I'm going to give my layer name circle. And what I tend to do is I drag and I drop the frame and then I drag it back. So now I have this symbol, not a symbol, this object. So this is not a symbol yet. I have this object all the way up to 35th frame. Now to add a tween, I would right click, create motion tween. And then I would select where exactly I want my object to end. So on the 35th frame, I could say I want it somewhere down here. What we see here is if we zoom in, these dots actually refer to the frames. So the number of frames we have running so far is 24 frames per second. I can increase that. I can increase that to whatever frames I want that movie to run at. So I could say, I want that to be running at, say, twice 70 frames. Let's get that 70 frames per second. Now, if we were to play that, once again, the ball will just fly up. It's much faster as opposed to the standard. I normally tend to keep it around 30, which gives you a decent sort of a tween, a decent animation. In addition to that, we currently have this straight line. I could actually curve it. So if I wanted to, for example, have this particular ball bounce or give it the effect, I could say, I want this to kind of come up. And I'll have to do it individually. It can be a bit tricky doing it one by one. So you can select the different frames. And I want that to come down a bit. It's not going to be a great bounce, but we will see, it comes down. There's a bit of a judder there. But in between, now what else can I do to this? I can select specific parts of my timeline, and I can then come down to the object and I can pull it down. And you will see each time I do that, there's a keyframe at that particular point on that timeline. I could do it on the 10th frame, so it's just going to go up and down now. And let's have it the other way. So I'm going to have it sort of go zigzag. And you could do that any time, anywhere on the timeline. So I'm doing it in increments of 5 frames, but I could do it in increments of 1 if I wanted to. I can move it slightly. Now if we play this, and the ball's going all over, it's in a frenzy right now. So that's basically, we've done some kind of frame-by-frame animation with a tween, a motion tween. Okay, now remember when we do create a particular tween, it creates a symbol. We can change this symbol. I could say free transform, and I could skew this if I want to. Now the whole image will be skewed throughout. Now I'm going to go back and close this. So basically we've just done motion tween, which we've been doing for some time, for a week or so. I'm going to now do the same thing, but this time I'm going to create a circle on the first frame, and I'm now going to do a frame-by-frame animation. A frame-by-frame animation is slightly different. I would be basically what cartoonists would generally do. They would draw frame by frame. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go to the second frame and right-click, insert keyframe. Okay, now what we have is we don't have a symbol. We just have normal vector images here. But what we can do is I can actually slightly start altering my circle each time I go to the next frame. I'm going to go to the next frame, insert keyframe, and I'm going to alter this a bit more. Insert keyframe. I'll keep doing this. So yes, this is going to take a bit longer because you're creating each frame and you're changing the object. And you may argue, well, there are other ways of doing this. Yes, there are. You can do it using a shape tween. A shape tween is another way, which we will cover. But what we have right now is we have in this object, we could have some kind of a heart here if we wanted to work on for it to be beating. So there's going to be moments where you are going to be using frame by frame animation as opposed to just a tween. When we do frame by frame, you can actually change the color. So you can change the object. We can add another object on that frame if we like. So I'm just going to add another object. I'll just change the color to maybe gray. I'm going to do the same thing on the next frame. I'm just going to move it up. I'm just copying and pasting that circle. And I'm just repositioning it slightly. And it can be difficult to go back and forth and see where exactly was that circle that I placed. But what you can do is you can use onion skinning. So onion skinning outline, onion skin. What that tells you is if I click on it, it will show me the last 5 frames, or in this case, the last 6 frames. So once again, what I did was I clicked on onion skinning. I could switch it off. When you select it again, you may want to be just checking the 2 frames. So here I just want to see what is the difference between this frame and the last frame. So onion skinning gives you better control in checking how the animation will sort of basically transition or morph into. So now when we play that, we have this circle that suddenly appears and disappears. So you need to be thinking, what sections of your animation are going to be frame by frame animation, what section is not going to be. So the example in the textbook, talks about work through a car, jumping over several buses. Or there's a motorbike actually jumping over several buses. I'd like you guys to spend the next 5 minutes of thinking, where will you be using frame by frame animation in your final project? Also, what you need to start thinking of is what is the storyline going to be for your final project. Remember, every final project should have a beginning, the middle section, and a conclusion. So what do most people tend to remember? The beginning and the ending. Of course, there's going to be some parts in the middle too. So you need to have some kind of a theme that's going to last 20 to 25 seconds. So you need to consider what backgrounds, what colors, what exactly is going to happen. So try to sketch out something or create a simple animation that you may be utilizing for your final project. So I'll give you 5 minutes to do that. Remember, the hardest part of your projects is going to be the idea. It's going to be difficult. That's the hardest part of most projects, is coming up with a unique idea. So you need to spend a fair bit of time trying to brainstorm. What I tend to do is write a few ideas, what you would like, and then obviously try to refine them. So by the time you get to week 6 or so on, then you'd have a better concrete idea of what your final project will come to be. So the question earlier on was, how do you have maybe a face and two eyes, they blink, it smiles. We're going to do nested animation. So we will actually do more of that.
Nested animation, we do that with the car wheels.
Yeah, it's similar to that, yes. So remember we did the car?
Yeah.
So we had the wheels. Now within the wheels, we could have, other animation, which could be nested. Yes. Okay, so we were talking about, frame by frame animation. I will actually come back to that. I'll try to sort of create a face with maybe blinking eyes or something. But right now we're going to move on to page 4-20. We're talking about create classic tweens. So it talks about, once again, animation, but it's a classic tween. So far, what we have done is we've, let me do a rectangle this time. I'll do a rectangle. So far, we've actually created the 30 frames. So far, we've actually done motion tween. That's what we've done. But now we're going to do a classic tween. Motion tween has only come about on the recent versions of Flash, from CS 5.5 onwards. Prior to that, generally, Flash used to have classic tween. So we are going to create classic tween. So let's actually do that. So once again, let me go back. So we create an object. There's our object. I could change it around a bit. Okay, let me just make it a bit darker so it's black. So now I'm going to give this name, this layer name object. And now I'm going to have this run for, say, 50 frames. Currently, my movie is running at 24 frames per second. So I've basically dragged, released, and dragged it back. Now I'm going to go to the last frame, 50th frame. I'm going to do right click, create classic tween. Create classic tween. Okay, I've done that. So nothing really happens right now when we play it. The symbol stays there, as opposed to, remember the motion tween, depending on where we move the object, we have to do the same thing. We have to say right click. Let's actually select the object. Right click, insert keyframe. So let's go back and do this again. So the steps I went through. So let's go back. So I've created this object and I'm going to have this run for 50 frames. I'm going to release it, left click and then drag it back. Remember that rectangle that appears just below. Mouse pointer. Now these are the steps you would need to do. Right click, create classic tween, then right click again, insert keyframe. This time you will see an arrow appear, which basically is telling you, yes, the tween has been created, but the object is still sitting at the same spot, so we need to move it. But we cannot actually change it as opposed to what we had with the previous tween. We can't actually put a curvature there. Nothing like that can happen. But what we can do is we can go to our timeline at particular points. We can say right click, insert keyframe, and then we can move the object. So we're kind of doing a frame by frame animation with the usage of tweening. So right click, insert keyframe, let's move that object. So it's basically just moving in straight lines. That's all that's happening right now. So if we were to play this, that's what's happening. It's just moving in straight lines. I could say, I want to sort of have it rotate a bit. So it rotates a bit there. Then it goes back. So it's rotating at this point, then it's going back to its original alignment. So what we're actually doing there is classic tween. So I'm just going to backtrack. Again, let's actually just do this. Let's just create another layer. Call this object. And let's call this square. Let's draw a square on this layer so we can actually compare the two. So here I'm going to do create motion tween. Okay, and now I'm going to move it, and then we see this. It's kind of like a guide. You know, our object is going to follow this particular guide, and we can change it anywhere we like. You know, we can move the object up and down any particular point, so we'll actually it will change. So once again, we can actually click on play here, or I tend to just press enter. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to introduce a guide just for the classic tween. A guide is basically something I'm going to draw, so I'm just going to take the pencil tool and I'm just going to just do that, just for the sake of it. I think I drew that in the wrong place, so I'm just going to go back. I'm going to draw it on layer 3, and I'm going to call it guide. And I'm going to use a pencil tool. I'm going to kind of smooth it. So at the bottom, I'm going to ensure what I do draw is going to be smooth. Now I'm going to, just have that. Maybe that's not the best one. Let's try it swirling. Can be a bit difficult with the mouse. So I've actually created a guide. It's basically just a line. That's all it is. I now right-click. I go to the layer where you see I've created this swirl using the pencil tool. In fact, you could also use the brush tool. Doesn't matter. I'm then going to go to the guide layer. I called it guide. I'll just call it spiral. Just call it S. Don't remember. Now right click. I'm going to go to and select guide. Select guide. Okay. Now something has happened. It's actually come up with this symbol with a guide. Now this object, which was actually tweening before, just followed a straight path. Let me just take this off the... I'm just going to delete the other animation. So we're just dealing with the classic tween. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go to the first frame and I'm going to pinch to the end. Then I'm going to go to the end. I think this should work. Does it work? Doesn't work. Let me see. Let's try again. So usually what you can do is, without converting it into a tween, I'm going to remove it, remove the tween, and then create the tween. So once again, we have this object. So the best option is to actually not to have the tween. So now I'm going to create the classic tween. So once we've created the guide, I'm going to create the classic tween. Right click, create classic tween, and right click, insert keyframe. And that should lock in place. Should generally lock in place. And it's not doing anything. Okay, I'm going to start again on this. Let's start again. Let's do one more try. So let's do a line for the sake of it. Let's introduce a bit of a curve. So I'm going to call this the guide. It's the name I'm using. Then I'm going to have another layer with the object. Create a circle. Okay, there you go. So now I'm going to take both of these objects, shift key down, and I'm going to drag and drop them to the 50th frame. Okay, and then I'm going to go to guide, create guide. Okay, I had to drag and drop that. into object. So what I just did, I need to drag and drop the layer into the guide, and then we'd see it's going to track that particular guide. So I'll do this again just to recap. So classic tween, right click, insert keyframe. Now I go to the edge of my timeline, and it should pinch, should actually stick to that guide, and now at the end it should stick to it. So I just take it to the edge of it. Maybe the black circle is not the best approach. So once again, let me do this once again. So ActionScript 3.0, I'm going to create a guide, and this time I'll actually use the brush. Okay, I'm going to use that as my guide. Then I'm going to create an object, call it circle, and let's give this a different color, say kind of orange. There's my circle. Let's move it here. Now I'm going to shift key down and select both these layers. So you can select multiple layers and drag them. So I'm going to shift key down and then drag these layers to the 50th frame, then drag them back. And remember, you can select and remove layers. So layers as well as frames. So if I wanted to remove from 40th frame onwards, I would select that 40th frame, shift key down, select that block of layers, the two layers and the frames that I want to remove. Then I'd right click, then I would go to remove frames. It will remove those particular frames. Okay, now going back to the guide, I go to the layer, select the layer name, which was guide, right click. I'm going to have to select guide, and then I need to drag and drop that into the guide layer. So drag and drop circle into the guide layer. Following that, I would create the classic tween. Right click, insert keyframe. Insert keyframe. And now it should, you would basically take the object and align it to the edge where you want that to start. And it should actually just pinch and connect to it. Then right at the end, I want that to come down there. So now if we were to play this, it will follow the path. Currently we actually see the guide, but when you play it, you won't see the guide. Okay, when you're working on it, you see the guide, but when you actually run the animation, you do not see the guide. So the example in the textbook refers to this bike, which basically jumps over these 4 buses over a ramp. Basically, this is how it's done using the guide. So the guide can be a great feature to use, especially if you want your animation to follow a particular path. So I'd like you guys to play around with that. I'll give you 10 minutes to see how you get along with the guide. So I'll give you 10 minutes on that. So the benefit of this is going to be it's easier to draw a path. As opposed to if you're using the standard sort of motion tween, it gets a bit tricky, to draw the exact swirls. Basically, I've got two planets, and I've got a rocket that goes around, and then it generally lands. So that's actually using a motion guide. Now, if I go into if I check my motion guide is this green line, then I've got my rocket, and I'm adjusting it as I'm going around because I want the point of that, the tip of the rocket to be aiming at or directing at the line itself. So it seems to be actually shooting towards that line as opposed to just going straight and across. So I've given you an example on that. There's other things we could add to this rocket. We could have some flares going at the back if we want to. So that would be more sort of nested. So there's another example on the moon. Don't look at the solution on that. How would you do that? And we'll come back to the animations. We'll come back to the animations on that. So think of that, but don't actually look at the solution. And I'll try to cover that next week, break it down. You know, how do you create that? So something to think about. Even though I have given you the solution, I may actually I may make that invisible. So make sure you think about how you can have a moon rotate around the Earth, for example. How could you do that?